Okay, so our first talk in this session is Robyn Carston, and her title is Metaphor and Non-Propositional Effects, Insights into What It Is Like, ...
Thank you very much, Kate. Okay, so can everyone hear me? Okay. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a bit of by way of introduction, a sort of lightning overview of what the very many disciplines that look at metaphor focus on. So, of course, starting with theoretical pragmatics, we tend to focus on interpretation, how the interpretation is brought about, and what we get at the end of that process. So in Gricean pragmatics, of course, as you know, there's a maxim flouting account such that the literal meaning flouts the maxim of truthfulness in something like "you are the cream in my coffee," or the maxim of informativeness in "no man is an island." That's a trivial truth. We already know that people are not islands. So the speaker makes as if to say, doesn't actually say P, the literal meaning, but just makes as if to say. And the thoughts that she wants to get across, she gets across via implicature. On the relevance theoretic account, on the other hand, there's no maxim flouting, of course. There are no maxims to be flouted. Using language metaphorically is just one way of fulfilling the presumption of optimal relevance. And the account that has been given in most recent years, not the very original account actually, back in '86, but more recently, is in terms of the construction of an ad hoc concept, which is a component of the explicature of the utterance. So in an utterance of "Mary is a wilting violet," the encoded concept wilting violet is modified, is broadened, in fact, in this particular case, to give us wilting violet star. And along with this communicated proposition, there's usually an array of implicatures, weak implicatures. So the account is fully propositional. Metaphor, as studied in psychology and psycholinguistics, tends to focus on actual comprehension processes, online processes, and the mental effort involved in deriving in the comprehension process. So there's lots of experiments measuring reading times. There's eye tracking, looking at how long the eyes dwell on the critical region, the metaphorical region. There are regressive eye movements and so on. And there is scanning, there's fMRI scanning of various brain areas, for example, to see whether there's imaging activity, sensory perceptual areas might be activated. And this is all done in a kind of comparative way, or at least typically it's done in a comparative way where you look at a metaphorical utterance and you look at the same time in the experiment at the literal counterpart to assess the mental effort involved. Then metaphor, as studied in literary studies, is really quite different, where I think the main focus is on something we might think of as aesthetic value of metaphors. And they tend to focus on more complex or extended metaphors than the simple ones that we use in experiments, or even largely in pragmatics, actually, but certainly in experiments where you need to control for all sorts of factors. But in literary studies, where things are a bit more open and flexible and open to interpretation, there are many extended metaphors that are discussed. Things like "life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage," which is the famous Macbeth example. And the literary theorists, they discuss the interpretive effects of such metaphors, and with a particular interest, I would say, in imagery, but also in the aptness, the beauty of a metaphor, and the experience that the reader has, the affective experience, the pleasure that the reader has. Then coming to metaphor as studied in philosophy of language, well, there's also an interest here in the aesthetic value of metaphor, but what I have been noticing in philosophy conferences that I've gone to is that there's an interest in the epistemic value, or the insights that a metaphor can give us. So this is sort of perhaps most obvious in the case of scientific metaphors. If you take something like infectious diseases invade and attack the body, this is a kind of warfare metaphor. And allegedly, and I'm going to come to this, this gives rise to a certain sort of insight or understanding about infectious diseases that you might not have otherwise. And then the question that I'm most interested in, and the cases that I'm most interested in, are poetic metaphors. So things like "the fog comes on little cat feet," and whether or not they have any kind of epistemic value, or at least can give us insights of some sort. So let me just say a word on poetic metaphors generally to sort of set these up to have to hand throughout the talk. Typically, we think of these as giving rise to non-propositional effects, imagistic sensory perceptual effects, affective attitudinal effects, and thus having an aesthetic value of some sort. Do they have also, this is my question here, an epistemic value? Do we gain insights? Do we learn anything from poetic metaphors? And the two that I'm going to mostly think about are these two given here, these two poetic metaphors, particularly the first one I'm going to focus on, largely because they're short, but they're also very, very striking. So this one from Ezra Pound, in a station of a metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And the line and a half from the beginning of a poem by Emily Dickinson, my life had stood a loaded gun in corners. Now, Sperber and Wilson, way back, actually, in the 86 book, said something very relevant here. They said some utterances exhibit rather than merely describe the speaker's mental or emotional state. They give rise to non-propositional effects, which would be lost under paraphrase. And certainly the literary critics would agree with this, given their heresy of the paraphrase of literary metaphors. However, as everyone here knows, Sperber and Wilson proposed to explain these effects in cognitive or propositional terms, or they certainly did back then, employing what was then, I think, a really crucial breakthrough notion, the notion of weak implicatures, which led to the following claim. What look like non-propositional effects associated with the expression of attitudes, feelings, and states of mind can be approached in terms of weak implicature. And there's another very nice quote, which I couldn't really fit on the slide, where they talk about apparently affective effects, which when viewed through the microscope of relevance theory, show us that what we have is a wide array of minute cognitive effects. Now, in more recent developments in relevance theory, which we heard about this morning from Tim and also later in the day from Hara in her talk on aesthetic experience, there's a much stronger focus on affective effects as real things in and of themselves. And this is a quote from Wharton and de Saussure, and they're not a subset of cognitive effects. Patricia Calaiti has also focused on what she calls positive perceptual effects, and these are not cognitive effects. So what these folk are doing is that they're looking at these non-propositional effects in non-propositional, non-conceptual terms. Okay, and so I want to see whether these non-propositional effects, ultimately, I want to look at whether or not they give us some particular insights, whether they have an epistemic value. But before I do that, I'm just going to have a quick look at scientific metaphors by way of contrast, really, based on a paper by Nicola Compa called Insight by Metaphor, the Epistemic Role of Metaphor in Science. And she starts by looking at what she calls pedagogical cases. So, for example, the metaphorical description of the structure of an atom in terms of the structure of the solar system. She says that actually this metaphor is amenable to complete non-metaphorical explication. So it's simply serving a pedagogical purpose. It has an epistemic value for the hearer, the person who doesn't know about the structure of atoms. But she's much more interested in what she calls theory constitutive metaphors. That is, metaphors which, at least for a time, constitute an irreplaceable part of the linguistic machinery of a scientific theory. They act as invitations or frameworks for research. And so let's come back then to the one I mentioned earlier, infectious disease understood as warfare. That is, in terms of an attack on an organism by an external invading army, with the organism mounting defenses, troops, barriers, other mechanisms to ward off or kill the invader. As Compa says, we exploit our knowledge about warfare, the source domain, in order to conceptualize and thereby come to a better understanding of the notion of an infectious disease, which is the target domain. This makes a certain line of thought available. It provides a specific perspective, but it also, she says, places a certain constraint on how we think about the topic. It makes us see certain aspects of a phenomenon, but it blinds us to others. And it may be that alternative metaphors are required to make certain thoughts thinkable that weren't thinkable before. And she cites here this guy, Ludwig Fleck, who has apparently argued that the warfare metaphor needs to be supplanted by a different kind of metaphor, that it doesn't mesh well enough with what we know about human biological processes. And so he is advocating a different metaphor where infectious disease is a complicated revolution within the organism. Okay, so now I want to just point out some what seem prima facie differences then between scientific and poetic metaphors. The target of scientific metaphors is things or phenomena in the external world, so things like infectious disease, atoms, genes. Whereas the target of poetic metaphors, I would claim, is typically inner subjective experiences or feelings. So like Pound's sudden perception, sudden experience of seeing those faces in the metro, Dickinson's sense of her life, of herself. Scientific metaphors, this is the second point, scientific metaphors have a referential function. They refer and describe, whereas poetic metaphors express or exhibit certain states of mind and evoke or activate images and feelings in the reader. Now, arguably, both scientific and poetic metaphors involve projecting from one better understood or more accessible domain to another less well understood domain. But what is projected or mapped may be different in the two cases. Properties and relations in the science case, so something propositional or cognitive, sensory, perceptual, and feeling affective qualities, something non-propositional in the poetic case. As mentioned on the previous slide, there is a process of metaphor replacement sometimes in science. So the warfare metaphor replaced for the internal revolution metaphor to characterize infectious diseases. There's no obvious counterpart to this in poetry. We wouldn't want it. I mean, we may assess certain metaphors as being more successful or more apt or more resonant than others, but we don't try to replace one metaphor by another. Usually, as far as I'm aware. Some of what we now, and Compa makes this final point, some of what we now in hindsight deem to be metaphorical language in science may not have been originally intended to be interpreted metaphorically at all. It might have been meant as a literal description. So apparently, some time ago, people used to talk about a life force or animal spirits, or elective affinity or attraction between particles or chemical substances. This now seems metaphorical, but it's not clear that it was intended that way originally. This doesn't carry over, I think, to poetic or literary metaphors, which are certainly intended to be interpreted metaphorically. They're intended to be taken as making us see or feel or understand something in terms of some other thing that it plainly is not. So finally, from Compa again, the epistemic role of metaphor in science. Metaphors may rescue us, she says, from an epistemic conceptual predicament by helping us grope our way into not yet understood territory. So that seems to be an important epistemic role for metaphors in science. And so my question, to repeat, is do poetic metaphors have any sort of epistemic role? Well, to approach this question, I'm asking another question, which is, well, why do we use metaphor, generally speaking? Why do we indulge in this odd practice, really, when you think about it, of producing blatant falsehoods? Well, we can say yes to extend our understanding of a domain that we don't know much about. That would apply to the scientific case. But also, and more relevantly here for my purposes, to extend our linguistic expressive capability and thus what we can communicate or share with others. So we can discriminate many more colors and shapes and sounds and textures and movements and general atmospheres than we have words to literally express. And of course, the same applies to we have many more feelings, moods, attitudes than we have the words to literally express. And I think Liz Camp's paper on demonstratives and metaphors is really interesting here. You wouldn't necessarily think there was much in common between demonstratives, things like this and that, and metaphors. But as she says, both draw on the hearer's, the reader's own direct experience, whether perceptual or affective, of the world. So yes, this is a quote from her: the fact that any given language contains only a finite number of fixed linguistic expressions constrains the range of properties its speakers can talk about directly. Demonstratives extend these linguistic resources significantly by enabling speakers to exploit the world itself in order to construct novel expressions by uttering things like, look at that, do it like this, where the hearer has to look to the world in order to fill in what the that is about and what the this is about. Metaphor, she says, can function communicatively much like demonstratives in this respect. And she gives this example of a drunk man leaning on a bar and someone saying, he's a wheezing bagpipe, which allows the speaker to capture the particular tone of his voice, that it's loud, that it's braying, that it's continuous, nasal, whining perhaps. As she says, these latter adjectives provide you with a general schema for imagining the relevant sound, but the metaphor is considerably more vivid and precise because it exploits your specific experiential knowledge of the sound that bagpipes make. Now, of course, you need to have had that experience of hearing bagpipes, in which case you're going to get a much richer interpretation of the metaphor than if you're somebody who's only heard that sound described using perhaps words like loud, braying, nasal, and so on. Okay, so the importance of this for me is this talk of making it such that the reader, the hearer, the audience, the addressee draws on their own experience, their own internal representations of feelings, perceptions, and so forth. So what is a poetic metaphor? And just a rough characterization here. It's something that expresses or exhibits a personal experience and evokes or activates sensory perceptual imagery or simulations and affective emotional responses in the hearer, the reader, the receiver. Just a couple of little quotes from Scruton here. I just recently reading his book on beauty, and amazingly, just in passing, he makes these interesting remarks about metaphor. That's not his topic. He says the important question about metaphor is not what property it stands for, but what experience it suggests. Figurative uses of language aim not to describe things, but to connect them, and the connection is forged in the feeling of the perceiver. Sometimes a writer simply places two things side by side, letting the experience of one leak into the experience of the other. Living metaphors change the way things are perceived. And this seems to me to capture almost perfectly what's going on with the Ezra Pound Station of a Metro poem. And Pound himself says, he calls this in a paper that he wrote about his experience, he calls this a metaphor-like superposition, where one idea is set up on top of another. In this paper, he describes his experience of suddenly seeing some beautiful faces in a Paris metro station, the intense feelings they evoked in him, and struggling to find words that were worthy or as lovely as that sudden emotion. Okay, well, I'm realized that I've really badly mistimed, and I'm sorry, so I'm going to have to skip a little bit here. So going halfway down this next slide, the idea that I want to press is that the literal meaning of the metaphor, that we, the readers, from that literal meaning, we, the readers, form a particular somatically marked image of the petals on the bough, that the damp, dark bough, and we superimpose that on the perception of faces against a crowd in the dark metro. And in that superimposition process, we see those faces differently. We get a new perspective, and we get a new, possibly intense, phenomenal experience. Definitely an aesthetic value here, but the question is, does it also have a certain epistemic value, giving us new insight into what it is like, the qualitative state of having a certain sensory perceptual or affective emotional experience. And if I had more time, I think I've probably only got about 6 minutes left, actually, or 5 or 6 minutes left. So I won't press further into some work by Adrian Pilkington, recent work by Adrian Pilkington. He worked on this many, many years ago, as some of you will know, but more recently he's done a philosophy dissertation on the communication of phenomenal states in poetry, including poetic metaphors. And I think this is really wonderful work. And I'm just very sorry that I am not going to be able to present it. And I should probably, Kate, is this right? I should probably go to my wrap-up slide.
Yeah, so we've got a bit of time for questions, I think. That would be
Okie doke.
Nice.
Okay, I will do that. Okay, so what does a good poetic metaphor communicate or express, and how does it communicate or express it? The answer to the what, I think, is an intense sensory perceptual experience, perhaps also an intense experience of feeling, emotion, or affect. I think the word epiphany is often relevant here. What is an epiphany? It's a sudden attention fixating revelation. And I think that's what Ezra Pound appeared to have as he suddenly was taken by what he saw in the metro. It's a vision of something strikingly different from what one normally sees or the way one normally sees it, and it may be transformative. Each of these is typically caused by something external to the experiencer, the poet, but it is not primarily that external thing that she seeks to communicate about, but rather the inner subjective experience she had as a result. How is this expressive, communicative function achieved? Well, as with all metaphor, a domain of the more familiar, the more publicly accessible is deployed to express something about a less familiar, perhaps entirely new, and or subjective, unobservable phenomenon. So the petals for a very particular subjective experience of seeing faces. The example I didn't talk about, but which was the one that Adrian Pilkington discusses, of something sticking to one's hands for a feeling of overwhelming guilt that Macbeth had. A loaded gun in a corner for the sense of one's life, the Dickinson example. An actor strutting about for a few hours on a stage for Macbeth's sense of the brevity and pointlessness of life. So I think I want to conclude by saying that such metaphors can be a source of insight for the reader, for the audience, into private, personal, ineffable experiences and states of mind of another person, in this case, a poet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's brilliant. So I'll open the floor to questions.
I still can't actually see hardly anybody, so you'll just have to.
Do you want to unshare your screen, or do you want to keep that open? If you unshare
I
it,
might keep it open just in case I get a chance to show some of the slides I didn't show.
So Anne has got in first with her hand up. So Anne.
Hi, Anne.
Hi. Oops. Thanks very much. That was a great, very interesting talk, Robyn. I just wondered, you set up this contrast between scientific metaphors and poetic metaphors, and I just wondered where you thought, I mean, I suppose you know the work of Eleanor Semino at Lancaster, who does a lot of stuff with cancer patients and is interested in
Yes.
the kind of metaphors that people use in cancer. And there's also a lot of work, you know, mainly sort of corpus work, looking at people who are chronic sufferers of pain, and looking at the kind of metaphors that and there's one project where people were invited to work with artists to try to work with some kind of visualization of their pain. Where does this fall on? Because I do think that these people are trying to say something about their personal experiences.
Okay, yeah, that's a really, really good point. I'm at a very early stage with this work. You know, this is not really in a way fully relevance theoretic in the usual sense. So I'm sort of, it's a bit of a departure brought on by rubbing shoulders with lots of philosophers at different conferences on metaphor. So I'm at a very early stage, and you've just alerted me to a whole area that I need to look at, the Eleanor Semino stuff. Yeah, really important. And these pain metaphors you mentioned, I might ask you for the reference at some point. I don't know. My first impulse was to say to you, oh, well, surely aren't the cancer metaphors, don't they fall in on the science side? That was what I would have my first impulse would have been to say. But yes, the pain cases, and which would include some of the cancer cases, I assume, is very much about an intense inner subjective experience. So, well, what can I say? It sounds as if there's going to be some kind of combination cases where we're both going to get this sort of more obvious epistemic role that the scientific cases have, where it sort of opens up a way of thinking about a disease or a health phenomenon of some sort, perhaps even understanding it better in propositional terms, possibly, I'm not sure. But also there's going to be these, I presume, non-propositional kinds of effects, responses to do with sensory perceptual phenomenal states and affective phenomenal states. So yeah, I guess there are going to be cases, and I just like to have a look at some particular examples where both are going to be pertinent, I assume. Thank you for that.
Ishmael.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really like the different different ways metaphor can reach our lives and comprehension. And there was one word, one aspect you mentioned at some point, and that's the epiphany part of, well, good poetic metaphors. And it reminded me of the work of Nigel Fabb, work on well, the experiences of ineffable significance. And it reminded me, would you agree that experiences from poetic metaphors are all the more intense as the mapping the mapping between domains that they allow are they are more intense as their mapping is unexpected and significant in a sense. So basically, the more unexpected those mappings are and unexpectedly significant in a sense, they are also more intense. Would you agree with, that view, which is not that far from what Fabb suggests in his work?
Well, I think there's a balance probably to be struck, isn't there? You know, you don't want something nonsensical or weird or two-way out for somebody to relate to. I mean, it's pretty unusual to think of one's life lived up to a certain point, as in the case of Dickinson, to think of it in terms of a loaded gun sitting in a corner. I mean, that's pretty jolly unusual. And it's part of her brilliance, of course, that she comes up with something like this. But you can do so much with that, can't you, in terms of the effects that you get off it, cognitive, probably perceptual, but certainly affective, and maybe something more than that, you know, a real sense of the quality of the life that one has led up to a certain point before she was sort of awakened by love, I think. So yeah, I need to look again at Nigel's work. I did read it many, many, many years ago, but this is all good. You guys are reminding me of things I need to look at.
You're welcome.
Yeah, he did Did he actually talk about epiphany? Because I had forgotten that.
Yeah, he mentioned that in his work. Yeah, in different contexts, literary, but also like you see a mountain, and I mean a big mountain, and it creates this I don't know the adjective, but epiphanical experience. You know, like it's well, but yeah, you're right. It also strikes a balance. I think he mentions that. It's also been a while. So, but yeah, thank you very much.
There has to be some sort of optimal balance between something which is really strange, too strange, and something that will give you a vast array of associations, I guess, that will be applicable to the topic.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks,
that was
Ishmael.
enlightening.
Let's have one last quick question. We've got Christoph. Would you like to?
I have a question on the distinction between metaphor and analogies. When you were talking about scientific metaphor, myself, I heard more scientific analogies. And here the distinction, and in terms of epistemic value, the distinction that I see is that in an analogy, you have a source domain, and you systematically recruit the inferences that you can make in the source domain in order to gain insight in the target model. And it's this systematicity that has really an important epistemic value. While in case of poetry, it's a metaphor, but it's more on the metaphor side because it's a one shot. So you gain insights, you recruit some inferences that you would do on the source domain, but it's one shot. It's more attached to the context. Would that? It's not. You did not talk about this continuum between metaphors and analogies.
No, I didn't. Another omission on my part. Yeah, really good point. And I can see that in the scientific case, particularly if it's sort of an ongoing tool in a way that scientists might use to sort of try to understand the topic, that infectious disease, let's say, that they might sort of go quite systematically through the various components of an invading army and what goes on, and sort of think about which ones do map quite directly. And this might be done over a period of time, yeah, as opposed to the sort of one-shot poetry case, which you think is more like metaphor proper, I take it. You know, a lot of people will say metaphors are just analogies. So, you know, there's a lot of, you know, that the faces are being in the Ezra Pound example, that there's an analogy being drawn between pale faces in a dark metro and pale petals on a dark bough. You know, I don't really like that for that sort of case, but you know, there's a lot to be pulled apart here, I think, with regard to metaphors, similes, analogies, and even these juxtapositions. Actually, my two cases were juxtapositions. They weren't explicit X is a Y type case. I think, you know, in poetry, you're going to get a lot of these just sort of straight juxtaposition type cases, which you're probably not going to get in science, where it's much more going to be set up, as you say, to provide you with a kind of framework for investigating in a particular way, to investigate the nature of the topic using what you get from the source domain. So yeah, I think again, a really interesting and important point. And if I'm going to carry on with trying to sort of compare scientific metaphors, so-called, and poetic metaphors, I need to attend to that distinction you've made. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for the questions. So we'll thank Robyn again for her talk, and move on to Daniel, who is next on our schedule.